Rain falls over Crime Alley the way it always has. Soft, patient, unhurried. It falls on brick that has darkened with 100 years of Gotham weather, on cobblestones slick with reflected neon, on a narrow gap between two buildings that the city has never quite managed to forget. Batman stands here now, cape heavy with water, breath slow beneath the cowl. He has stood in this exact place more times than he could count. Some nights he tells himself he is here to patrol. Some nights he tells himself nothing at all. Tonight he simply stands and lets the rain do what rain does, settle into the cracks of things and reveal what has always been there. He crouches the way he has crouched here as a boy and later as a man, and studies the wall beside the alley's mouth. There, a small mark in the brick, no larger than a coin. A bullet's impression, decades old, softened by weather but never quite erased. He has traced this mark with his fingers before. He traces it again now, slowly, the way another man might touch an old photograph. Beside it, a crack runs downward through the mortar, thin, forked, like a vein beneath skin. It was not there in the earliest photographs of this alley. It appeared sometime in the years after. Buildings change, cities change, but some things remain exactly as they were left, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. He remembers being 8 years old in this alley, kneeling on cold stone beside two people he loved more than anything in the world, and understanding, even then, even as a child, that something about the moment did not fit together the way the police said it did. He couldn't have explained it then. He was too young, too frightened, too far inside his own grief to find the words. But something in him, some early, unformed instinct, had already begun to ask a question. Why doesn't this feel complete? The police closed the case within the year, a robbery gone wrong, a frightened man with a gun, a string of pearls, 2 gunshots in the dark. Simple, tragic, explainable. The city grieved, and then the city moved on, the way cities always do, because a city cannot stop moving without dying a little itself. But Bruce Wayne never moved on. Not really. He grew older and richer and quieter, and beneath all of it, the question remained exactly where it had always been. Small, persistent, patient as rain. A witness statement that changed between one telling and the next. A shell casing that never quite matched what should have been there. A missing page from an old file, never explained, never recovered. A photograph that showed something no one else seemed to notice. None of it was proof of anything. He knew that even now. Small inconsistencies exist in every case, every file, every human memory. Most of them mean nothing at all. But Bruce had learned, over the long years of his life, that most of them is not all of them. And a detective's entire discipline is built on caring about the exception. He rises slowly, water running from the edges of his cape, and looks up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the buildings. Somewhere above the clouds, Gotham's stars are doing what they always do, existing, indifferent, unbothered by the small tragedies of the city beneath them. He was not born the world's greatest detective. No one is born anything. He became it, slowly, deliberately, one lesson at a time, across years and continents and quiet rooms filled with dust and old paper. It began here, in this alley, with a question that refused to disappear. And so, tonight, we go back. Not to the night his parents died, That story has been told enough times that Gotham could recite it in its sleep. Tonight we go back to what came after, to the boy who could not let the question go, to the young man who realized that grief alone would never be enough, that if he wanted the truth, he would have to learn how to see the world the way almost no one else ever had. Tonight, we walk quietly beside him, through libraries where dust drifts gold in lamplight, through monasteries where candles burn low against mountain wind, through crime scenes long since forgotten by everyone except the man kneeling in them. We watch him fail. We watch him learn. We watch a frightened boy become, patiently, deliberately, across the slow architecture of an entire life. A detective. Rain continues to fall over Crime Alley, and somewhere far beneath Wayne Manor, in a cave lit by the pale blue glow of humming machines, the story of how it all began waits quietly to be remembered. Let's begin. Before Bruce Wayne ever left Gotham, before there was any thought of monasteries or mentors or distant cities, there was a boy sitting alone in a room lined with cardboard boxes. The Wayne family study had always smelled of old leather and pipe smoke, of his father's books and his mother's quiet perfume lingering faintly in the curtains. Now it smelled of dust. Alfred had tried, more than once, to clear the boxes away. Case files Bruce had requested through lawyers and favours, and eventually simple stubbornness. Each time, Bruce asked him to leave them exactly where they were. He was 14 the first time he read the complete police file on his parents' deaths, cover to cover, by lamplight, at 2 a.m. He expected answers. He found only more paper, officer statements, evidence logs, a coroner's report written in dry clinical language that turned 2 people he loved into measurements and timestamps. A hand-drawn diagram of the alley, its angles slightly wrong, as if the officer sketching it had never quite stood in the right place. It was here, in this very room, that Bruce learned his first and most important lesson as a detective, though he would not have the language for it for many more years. Facts and truth are not the same thing. A fact is what someone wrote down. Truth is what actually happened. Between the two lies memory, fear, exhaustion, assumption, and the simple human tendency to fill silence with a story that makes sense. He noticed it first in a small contradiction buried on page 11. A witness, a woman named Mrs. Chalmers, who had been walking her dog 2 blocks from the alley that night, was recorded in her initial statement as saying she heard 2 gunshots. In a follow-up statement, taken 9 days later, she said 3. No one had circled it. No one had questioned it. It sat there in the file, unremarked, the way small inconsistencies always do, buried beneath the weight of a case everyone had already decided was closed. Bruce circled it himself, in pencil, and sat with the pencil resting against his lip for a long time. Why would a memory grow more detailed with time instead of less? He did not know the answer. He would not know it for years. But he understood, even then, that the question mattered more than any comfort a closed case file could offer him. He began reading everything. Every newspaper account of the murder, some contradicting others in small, telling ways. Every police report he could obtain on similar Gotham robberies from that era, searching for patterns the original detectives might have missed. He taught himself to read a document the way a jeweler examines a stone, not for what it claimed to show, but for the flaws hidden beneath its surface. He learned that eyewitnesses lie without meaning to, that memory reshapes itself every time it is recalled, smoothing its own edges, borrowing details from things it did not actually see. that a tired detective, under pressure to close a case and calm a frightened city, will sometimes accept the simplest explanation rather than the most accurate one. None of this proved his parents' case had been mishandled. He was careful, even as a boy, not to let grief become conclusion. But it proved something else, something that would matter far more in the long run. It proved that the world was full of small gaps between what people said and what was actually true, and that somewhere in those gaps, real answers were waiting for someone patient enough to look. Alfred found him that way often in those years, hunched over a desk lit by a single lamp, surrounded by paper, a boy quietly teaching himself to doubt. "You won't find peace in those files, Master Bruce," Alfred told him once, gently, standing in the doorway with a tray he knew would go untouched. "I'm not looking for peace," Bruce answered, without looking up. "I'm looking for what's missing." It was the truest thing he had ever said about himself, though neither of them fully understood it yet. He did not know, that night, that this quiet habit, reading, doubting, circling small inconsistencies in pencil, was the very first brick in the foundation of something the world would one day fear and trust in equal measure. He only knew that the file on his desk did not feel finished, and that feeling, small, stubborn, and impossible to shake, would lead him eventually far beyond the walls of Wayne Manor, in search of people who could teach him to see what the original detectives never had. The world is larger and quieter than Gotham ever let you believe. And Bruce Wayne spent the better part of a decade learning exactly how large, exactly how quiet. He left the city not as an heir-seeking distraction, though the newspapers assumed exactly that, running photographs of a bored young playboy drifting between continents. The truth, known only to Alfred and eventually to no one else at all, was far simpler. Bruce was searching for teachers. Not teachers of violence, though those would come later and matter greatly. First, he searched for teachers of sight. In a small fishing town on the coast of a country he never named even in his own private notebooks, he spent 4 months apprenticed to an old forensic examiner who had spent 30 years reading bloodstains the way other men read novels. The old man's laboratory was little more than a converted shed, lit by a single bare bulb, smelling of chemicals and salt air. He taught Bruce that a single drop of blood, fallen from a certain height at a certain angle, tells a story more reliable than any human witness. That spatter patterns do not lie, do not forget, do not grow more detailed with time the way a nervous woman's memory might. Bruce thought of Mrs. Chalmers' statement often during those months. 2 gunshots, then 3. He began to wonder, quietly, whether the blood in that alley, had anyone actually examined it properly, might have told a story different from the one everyone had agreed to believe. He filed the thought away, as he had learned to file every small thread of the case. Not yet. Not proof. Just another loose stone in a very long path. From the forensic examiner's shed, Bruce travelled to a mountain village where an old tracker taught him to read footprints in soil the way most people read handwriting. The weight of a step, the drag of a heel, the subtle asymmetry that reveals an old injury or a hidden weapon. He learned that no 2 people walk exactly alike, and that the ground remembers far more than most investigators ever bother to ask it. He travelled next to a city of narrow alleys and stone bridges, where an aging escape artist, a small, quick-eyed man who had once performed in circuses across 3 continents, taught him something entirely different. Not how to escape, but how the mind of a trapped man behaves, how panic narrows thought, how desperation makes people predictable in ways calm reasoning never does. From an illusionist in a crumbling theatre, he learned the architecture of a lie, how misdirection works not by hiding the truth, but by making the eye want to look somewhere else. He began to notice how often criminals, without training or intention, used the very same principles. A staged crime scene, a convenient alibi, a too perfect witness. From a historian buried in the archive of an ancient university, he learned patience. The kind of patience that reads 1,000 pages to find one true sentence, that treats absence of evidence as its own kind of clue. Each teacher saw the world differently. The forensic examiner saw chemistry. The tracker saw weight and motion. The escape artist saw fear. The illusionist saw attention. The historian saw pattern across time. None of them, alone, could have solved anything of consequence. But together, layered one atop another, inside a single patient mind, they began to form something new. Bruce filled notebook after notebook with their lessons, his handwriting growing tighter and more precise with each passing year, as though his own thoughts were slowly organizing themselves into evidence. Late one night, in a small rented room above a quiet street in a city whose name he would later never write down, Bruce opened his oldest notebook, the one he had carried with him since Gotham, its corners soft with handling, and reread the sentence he had underlined years earlier. Why did the evidence never feel complete? He no longer expected the notebook to answer him, but for the first time, he understood that he was gathering the tools that might, one day, let him answer it himself. He closed the notebook, extinguished the candle, and lay awake a long while listening to rain against an unfamiliar window, thinking of Gotham, thinking of an alley he had not seen in years, thinking of a mystery that had never once stopped waiting for him. There is a particular quiet that settles over a laboratory at night. Not the silence of emptiness, but the hush of instruments waiting patiently to be used. Bruce came to know that quiet intimately during the years he spent apprenticed to scientists who rarely knew his real name. In a converted monastery in the hills of a country known for its precision instruments, an elderly criminologist taught him to read fingerprints the way a musician reads notation. Not as static shapes, but as living patterns, each ridge and whirl telling a story of pressure, angle, and the particular oils of human skin. He learned that no two prints, across the entire recorded history of human beings, had ever been found identical. He learned to lift a print from glass with nothing but breath and fine powder, coaxing invisible truth into visible form. He thought, more than once during these lessons, of the shell casing recovered from Crime Alley all those years ago. A small brass cylinder that had passed through so many hands, entered so many evidence bags, that its own story had grown as smudged and uncertain as the case itself. The report had described it as consistent with a common revolver, the kind sold in 100 pawn shops across Gotham. But Bruce, now trained to notice what casual eyes overlooked, remembered a photograph from the original file, grainy, poorly lit, in which the casing's markings seemed subtly wrong. A detail no one else had ever flagged, a detail he could not yet prove meant anything at all. He wrote it in his notebook, beside the entry about Mrs. Chalmers' shifting memory, and underlined nothing, because he had learned by now the danger of underlining a theory before it had earned the ink. From fingerprints, his education deepened into footprints. Not merely the tracking skills he had learned in the mountains, but the forensic precision of measuring stride length, depth, and wear pattern to estimate a person's height, weight, even their emotional state in the moment the print was made. A frightened man's stride differs from a confident one. A running man's weight distributes differently than a walking man's. The ground, he had come to believe, was the most honest witness in any crime. He studied blood spatter more deeply now, understanding velocity and trajectory well enough to reconstruct, from dried stains alone, the exact position of a wound relative to a wall, a floor, a doorway. He studied broken glass, how a window pane shattered by force from outside scatters differently than one broken from within, the fracture lines forming a story as legible as handwriting to anyone patient enough to read them. He studied handwriting itself, pressure, slant, the subtle tremors that reveal fatigue, deception, or fear. A forger, he learned from a quiet old document examiner in a city built on canals, does not merely copy shapes. He must copy rhythm, and rhythm is the hardest thing in the world to fake convincingly. He studied ash, learning to distinguish burned paper from burned cloth, burned wood from burned bone, each leaving its own particular signature beneath a microscope's patient eye. He studied dust, the way it settles differently in a room recently disturbed than in one long undisturbed, the way its very composition can reveal the passage of months or years. He studied fabric fibers, learning that a single thread caught on a nail or a splintered doorframe can outlive the crime itself by decades, waiting silently for someone to finally notice it. Late in this period of his education, alone in a rented laboratory borrowed for a single night's practice, Bruce laid out photocopies of his parents' case file across a long steel table, the way he had learned to lay out any set of evidence, methodically, without emotion, each page given equal weight, regardless of what it asked him to feel. He noticed for the first time that page 7 of the original evidence log was missing from every copy he had ever obtained. Not damaged, not blank, simply absent, as though it had never been filed at all, absence marked only by a small clerical note, "See attached." Nothing was attached. A missing page, a shifted memory, a shell casing whose markings did not sit quite right in an old photograph. 3 small threads, none of them proof, all of them patient. He gathered the photocopies, placed them carefully back into their folder, and allowed himself, for just a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to finally understand what page 7 had once contained. Then he closed the folder, turned off the lamp, and returned to his training. Because he had learned by now that a detective does not solve a case by wanting the answer badly enough. He solves it by becoming, patiently, the kind of person capable of finding it. There is a temple in a valley so remote that mail took 3 weeks to arrive by mule, and it was here, among monks who had taken vows of near total silence, that Bruce Wayne learned the lesson that would matter more than almost any other in his long education. The head of the order was an old woman with pale, clouded eyes, nearly blind, Bruce would learn, though she moved through the temple's stone corridors with a confidence that made visitors forget her condition entirely. She had spent 40 years training herself and others in what she called simply listening, though Bruce would come to understand it as something far more complete than the words suggested. She taught him first to sit in silence for hours at a time, doing nothing but noticing. The particular rhythm of wind moving through a mountain pass, the subtle difference between one person's footsteps and another's on stone worn smooth by centuries, the way breathing changes almost imperceptibly in the half-second before a person prepares to lie. Most people, she told him, in a voice as quiet as the temple's own stillness, believe a detective's work begins when he asks a question. It does not. It begins in the silence before the question is even needed. Bruce spent months learning to hear what people did not say. He learned that a hesitation of even a quarter second before answering a simple question often signals a mind constructing rather than remembering. He learned that people who are telling the truth rarely need to look away, while people who are performing innocence often look directly at you for slightly too long, aware, on some unconscious level, that eye contact is what honesty is supposed to look like. He learned to read the small, involuntary tells of the human body, a swallow before a difficult confession, a shift in weight before a lie, the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed exactly what they intend to say. One evening, sitting across from the old woman in candlelight, Bruce found himself, without quite intending to, telling her about the alley, about the rain, about the two people he had lost, and the case file that had never once felt complete. She listened without interrupting, her clouded eyes fixed somewhere just past his shoulder, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long while. "Tell me," she finally said, "about the witness, the one whose memory grew." Bruce recounted it, Mrs. Chalmers, 2 gunshots becoming 3, 9 days between statements. "And in 9 days," the old woman said slowly, "did anyone ask her why her memory changed? Or only accept that it had?" Bruce sat with the question a long time. He did not know the answer. It had never occurred to him, in all his years of reading that file, to wonder what conversation might have taken place between the 2 statements, what she might have seen or heard or been told in those 9 quiet days that reshaped what she remembered. It was, he would realize much later, one of the most important questions anyone had ever asked him about his parents' case. Not what changed, but why it changed, and who, if anyone, had been present when it did. He wrote the question in his notebook that night, beside the others, and for the first time he allowed himself to draw a single tentative line connecting it to the missing page 7. Not a conclusion, just a shape beginning, faintly, to suggest itself. The old woman continued his training for months after that, teaching him to distinguish grief from performance, fear from calculation, the particular silence of someone hiding something from the silence of someone simply overwhelmed. He learned that criminals, more often than not, reveal themselves not in what they say, but in the shape of what they carefully avoid saying. When it came time to leave the temple, she walked into the gate herself, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You came here searching for a way to hear the truth," she said. "You will leave instead, having learned to hear the absence of it. That is the rarer skill. Guard it carefully." Bruce carried her words with him down the mountain, through years of further training, and eventually home, to a city built on silence of its own particular kind, where the truth, he was beginning to understand, was rarely spoken aloud. It only waited, patiently, for someone willing to notice everything that was left unsaid. Gotham welcomed Bruce Wayne home the way it welcomed everyone eventually, with rain and noise and the particular grey light that made the whole city look like a photograph slowly developing. He returned older than his years, quieter than the tabloids expected, and utterly unrecognizable to anyone who might have known the boy who left. Alfred met him at the airfield without a word of surprise, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on the calluses across Bruce's knuckles, the new stillness in the way he stood. "Welcome home, Master Bruce," was all he said. It was enough. In the years that followed, Gotham itself became Bruce's final and most demanding classroom. Every rooftop he crossed at night taught him something about sightlines and shadow. Every alley he walked taught him about the particular geography of desperation, where a frightened person runs, where a confident one walks, where evidence tends to collect in the corners the city forgets to sweep. He studied abandoned warehouses the way he had once studied ancient temples, learning to read dust undisturbed for years, rust patterns that told the true age of a broken lock, graffiti that marked territory as clearly as any official boundary line. He began, in these early years, to test everything his teachers had given him, quietly, methodically, without ever revealing himself. He would visit old, unsolved cases in the GCPD archive under invented pretenses, cross-referencing decades-old evidence logs against what he now understood about blood spatter, fingerprint aging, fiber degradation. Twice he found small errors buried in cases long since closed, errors no one else had ever noticed because no one else had ever been trained to look. He did not correct them, not yet. He simply confirmed to himself that his years abroad had given him something rare, not superhuman ability, but a way of seeing that almost no one else in the city possessed. One night, restless, he returned to Crime Alley for the first time since his childhood departure from Gotham. The alley had changed in small ways. New graffiti, a boarded window replaced with a slightly different pane of glass. But the essential geometry of the place remained precisely as he remembered it, and he found himself once again kneeling exactly where he had knelt as a boy. It was here, examining the brickwork by flashlight, that he noticed something new. A faint discoloration low on the wall, a rust-coloured stain long since faded into the mortar, positioned slightly differently than where the original report placed the point of impact. He measured the distance twice, comparing it against the diagram he had memorized years ago from the police file. The discrepancy was small, 18 inches, perhaps less. It could mean nothing. Buildings settle, walls shift, memory of exact placement fades even in official documents. But 18 inches, in a case built entirely on a single, simple narrative, was not nothing. It was a thread. Another one, joining the others in his notebook. The changed testimony, the missing page, the shell casing that never quite matched its photograph. He rose slowly, rain beginning again overhead, and looked once more at the alley that had shaped the entire architecture of his life. He was not ready, not yet, to pursue these threads directly. He understood, with the same discipline that had carried him through years of training, that a detective who chases a personal case too early, with an incomplete method, risks destroying the very evidence he hopes to understand. So instead, he turned his attention outward. If Gotham was to be his classroom, then Gotham's own forgotten mysteries would be his practice. Cases the police had abandoned, disappearances no one else had time to solve, locked rooms and missing children and silences the city had simply learned to live with. He would test himself against them, one at a time, quietly, without recognition, until the day came when his own case, the oldest mystery of his life, would finally receive the kind of attention it had always deserved. That night, walking home through wet, empty streets, Bruce Wayne began for the first time to imagine what he might eventually need to become in order to move through Gotham unseen, unafraid, and utterly undistracted by anything the city could throw at him. He did not yet have a name for what he was becoming, but somewhere above him, in the manor's oldest wing, a cave waited in darkness beneath the house, as though it too had been patient all these years for someone finally ready to fill it. The city keeps its failures quietly, tucked into filing cabinets nobody opens and case numbers nobody remembers. Batman found them there, one by one, in the earliest years of his work. Not the loud crimes that made headlines, but the soft, patient mysteries the GCPD had simply run out of time to finish. A missing child from the Narrows, gone 11 years, her file thin and dusty, containing little more than a single photograph and a mother's unanswered letters requesting updates that never came. A locked apartment in the Bowery, where an old collector had died alone behind a bolted door, the room undisturbed, though something small and valuable had vanished from within it. A stretch of forgotten tunnels beneath Gotham's oldest subway line, rumoured for decades to connect to buildings that no longer officially existed. Batman worked through them the way his teachers had taught him, patiently, methodically, never assuming, always measuring twice. The missing girl, he discovered after 3 quiet nights spent re-interviewing neighbours the police had never bothered to revisit, had not vanished at all in the way everyone assumed. A small, overlooked detail in an old utility record, a gas bill paid, years after her disappearance, under a name close enough to her mother's maiden name to have been dismissed as coincidence, led him eventually to a modest apartment 3 boroughs away, and a reunion no one in Gotham's press ever learned had occurred. The locked room in the Bowery took longer, 4 nights of careful measurement, comparing dust patterns against the bolted door's own mechanism, before Batman understood that the room had never truly been locked from the inside at all. The bolt itself had been reversed, years earlier, by a nephew who had long since inherited everything the old collector once owned, and had simply never expected anyone to look closely enough to notice. Each solved case taught him something new about the shape of Gotham's forgetting. The city did not lack evidence. It lacked patience. Detectives before him had not failed because they were foolish. Most had failed simply because they were exhausted, underfunded, buried beneath caseloads that made this kind of quiet, obsessive attention impossible. Batman had something none of them had ever had. Time, discipline, and a personal, unspoken reason to believe that even the coldest case might still contain a warm thread, waiting patiently to be pulled. It was during his investigation into the old subway tunnels, searching for a maintenance worker who had vanished decades earlier under circumstances the original report described only as unresolved, that Batman found himself, unexpectedly, thinking again of his parents' file. Among the workers' few belongings, recovered finally from a sealed maintenance closet no one had opened in 30 years, was a photograph. Ordinary, unremarkable, except for the smudged handwriting on its back, half erased by time and damp. It was not connected to his parents' case at all, but the photograph's condition, faded ink, a caption partially lost to moisture, reminded him sharply of another photograph, buried in his parents' own file, one he had studied 100 times without ever quite trusting his own read of it. In that old photograph, taken by a beat officer on the night of the murder, meant simply to document the alley's layout, there was a shape in the background, half obscured by shadow and rain, that Bruce had never been able to fully identify. Not a person, necessarily, perhaps nothing at all, a trick of old film grain and poor lighting. But now, holding this newer, equally damaged photograph in his gloved hands, Batman found himself wondering whether the original crime scene photographer had used the same faulty equipment that so many GCPD units carried in those years. Equipment known, he now recalled from his forensic training, to occasionally introduce exactly this kind of shadow artifact under specific lighting conditions. It was a small, technical thought, not a breakthrough, just another quiet thread, joining the others in a notebook that had grown thick with careful, patient uncertainty. He solved the tunnel worker's disappearance 3 nights later, a tragic accident, decades overdue for acknowledgement, allowing a grieving family finally to grieve completely rather than wonder. Walking home afterward through Gotham's wet, sleeping streets, Batman understood something new about the discipline he had spent so many years building. Every solved mystery, no matter how small, no matter how far removed from his own personal case, brought him one step closer to the kind of investigator capable, someday, of finally understanding the one mystery he had never been able to close. There came a point, some years into his work, when Batman noticed that footprints and fingerprints, however precise, had begun to tell him less than he needed to know. Evidence explained what had happened. It rarely explained why. And in Gotham, he was beginning to understand why was very often the only question that mattered. He began studying criminal psychology with the same discipline he had once given to blood spatter and dust patterns. Not through crime scenes now, but through interrogation rooms, prison interviews, and the quiet, patient study of behavior over time. He learned to recognize fear in a suspect's shoulders before it ever reached their voice. He learned that greed moves differently than desperation. Greed calculates, desperation improvises. He learned that pride, more than almost any other motive, causes criminals to leave behind exactly the kind of evidence a patient detective needs. Because pride cannot resist the temptation to be clever, to leave a signature, to be recognized even while trying to remain hidden. He learned, too, about regret, the quietest and most complicated of criminal emotions, and often the most revealing. A regretful criminal, he discovered, frequently returns to the scene of what they've done, not out of carelessness, but out of an unconscious need to understand themselves, what they had become in that moment. It was during this period of study that Bruce found himself reconsidering, for the first time with real analytical weight, the accepted motive behind his parents' murder. Robbery gone wrong. The phrase had appeared in every report, every newspaper account, every closed case summary for decades. A frightened man, panicking, firing 2 or 3 shots in a moment of chaos. But now, having spent years learning to read the actual behavioral patterns of frightened, desperate criminals, Bruce found the explanation sitting uneasily beside everything he had come to understand. A truly panicked robber, he now knew from patient study of hundreds of similar cases, rarely fires more than once before fleeing. Multiple shots suggested either extraordinary panic, which typically produced wildly inaccurate, poorly placed wounds, or something closer to control. The wounds described in his parents' coroner's report had been precise, frighteningly precise, for a man supposedly overcome by fear. He sat with this thought for a long time, alone in the manor's old study, the same room where he had first begun reading the file as a boy. He reminded himself, as he always did, not to let a compelling theory outrun the evidence supporting it. A precise shot could still be accidental. A frightened man could still, by chance, fire accurately. He had learned, above almost everything else in his years of training, that the detective who falls in love with a theory before the facts confirm it becomes exactly the kind of investigator he had spent his whole life training not to be. But he allowed himself, that night, one small, honest admission. The comfortable story Gotham had told itself for decades, a random tragedy, a frightened stranger, nothing more, no longer felt, to the trained eye he had spent so many years building, like the complete truth. It felt like the truth that had been easiest to accept at a time when the city needed comfort more than it needed accuracy. He added the thought to his notebook, beside the changed testimony, the missing page, the mismatched shell casing, the 18 inches of displaced stain upon the alley wall. 5 threads now, none of them proof, all of them patient, all of them waiting for the day he would finally have both the evidence and the discipline to follow them wherever they led. In the meantime, Gotham's criminals continued to provide him an unexpected gift, a living laboratory of motive and behavior, each one teaching him something new about the architecture of the human mind under pressure. He did not yet know that some of the city's strangest, most broken minds were still ahead of him. Minds that would not simply commit crimes, but would turn crime itself into a kind of language, one built entirely around being understood. He closed the notebook, extinguished the lamp, and allowed himself, for the first time in a long while, to imagine that someday Gotham's most complicated criminals might teach him more about his parents' case than any piece of physical evidence ever could. Arkham Asylum sits at the edge of Gotham like a held breath. Grey stone, high walls, windows too narrow to let in much beyond a suggestion of daylight. Batman came to know its corridors as intimately as he knew his own cave, though for entirely different reasons. He did not visit Arkham's inmates as an interrogator. He visited them, patiently, over years, as a student visits difficult teachers. Men and women whose minds had broken in ways that revealed, with terrible clarity, the exact pressure points of human nature. The Joker taught him, more than anyone else ever could, about the fragility of meaning itself. How a mind pushed far enough past its breaking point can begin to find the absence of order more comforting than order's presence. Batman never enjoyed these conversations, but he listened to them the way his old temple teacher had taught him to listen, for the silence beneath the words, for what the laughter was covering rather than expressing. The Riddler taught him something quieter and, in its way, more useful, that some criminals do not wish to escape detection at all. They wish, desperately, to be understood, and construct elaborate puzzles not to defeat the detective, but to prove, finally, to someone, anyone, that their mind deserved to be taken seriously. Batman learned to solve his riddles not merely with logic, but with a kind of reluctant compassion, understanding that behind every clue lay a man convinced that being clever was the only form of love he had ever successfully received. Two-Face, more than any other inmate, forced Batman to sit with a question that echoed uncomfortably against his own life. A man split cleanly between the life he had built and the tragedy that shattered it, unable to fully reconcile the two halves of himself. Batman recognized, in Harvey Dent's fractured reflection, a warning about what obsession without balance might eventually cost a person who refused, even once, to let an old wound rest. Scarecrow taught him about fear itself, not merely how to induce it, but how it operates as a language, reshaping perception, convincing even careful minds that danger exists where none does, or that safety exists where it absolutely does not. Batman studied this lesson with particular care, understanding that a detective's greatest vulnerability was not physical danger, but the possibility of being manipulated into seeing evidence that was never truly there. It was, unexpectedly, during a long and largely one-sided conversation with the Riddler, who delighted, above almost everything else, in the puzzle of Batman's own hidden motivations, that Bruce received a small, accidental gift. "You're not really here about me," the Riddler said one evening, tilting his head with theatrical curiosity. "You're here because somewhere there's a puzzle you can't solve. I can always tell. The really good detectives are all running from one unfinished case. What's yours, Batman? A person? A name? A missing piece someone never gave you back? Batman said nothing, but the phrase lodged itself uncomfortably in his memory. A missing piece someone never gave you back. He thought, walking back through Arkham's cold corridors that night, of page 7, the single missing page from his parents' original case file, absent without explanation for over 2 decades. He had always assumed it lost to simple bureaucratic carelessness. For the first time, walking beneath Arkham's high stone walls, he allowed himself to wonder whether lost and missing might, in this particular case, mean 2 very different things. It was not evidence. It was barely even a theory, but it was enough, as it always seemed to be every 20 or 30 nights of his long life, to keep the oldest question in Bruce Wayne's life quietly, patiently alive. He returned to his cave before dawn, added the thought to a notebook now worn soft at its edges from years of handling, and allowed himself, briefly, to imagine the day he might finally hold that missing page in his own 2 hands. Arkham's lessons continued for years afterward, each broken mind teaching him something new about the fragile architecture of human thought. But it was this one small, offhand remark from a man who solved puzzles purely to be understood that Bruce carried with him longest, back down into the quiet dark beneath Wayne Manor, where an old case file waited patiently, as it always had, for him to finally return to it. There came a night, years later, when Batman stood in a satellite orbiting far above Gotham's familiar reign, surrounded by people who could move planets, outrun light, and survive conditions that would erase an ordinary man in an instant. And still, when the room fell silent, waiting for direction, it was Batman they turned to. He had never grown entirely used to it, the quiet weight of that trust. Superman could lift a collapsing building from 100 people in a single motion, yet he waited, patiently, for Batman to finish examining a single strand of fiber recovered from beneath a villain's fingernail. Wonder Woman, who carried centuries of wisdom and had faced down gods, deferred without hesitation to Batman's read of a suspect's shifting eye contact during interrogation. The Flash, capable of circling the earth before most people finished a sentence, learned early to simply wait, however impatiently, for Batman's conclusions, rather than rush ahead of them. He had never become the strongest person in any room he entered. He understood this plainly, without bitterness. He had built himself, instead, into something rarer, the person whose conclusions people trusted more than their own instincts, because his conclusions were never built on instinct at all. They were built on decades of patient, disciplined observation, tested against error more times than any of his more powerful colleagues could imagine enduring. During a long, quiet debrief following a case that had taken the League through 5 countries and an old, decommissioned laboratory hidden beneath a mountain, Superman lingered after the others had gone, watching Batman quietly reorganize a set of evidence folders into precise, careful order. "You never explain how you know things," Superman said, not accusingly, simply curious. "You just know them. How?" Batman did not look up immediately. "I don't know things," he said. "I notice them. There's a difference. Most people stop looking the moment they feel confident in an answer. I've trained myself never to feel confident, just patient." It was, though neither of them fully realized it in the moment, the clearest summary Batman had ever given of the entire education that shaped him. The forensic examiner's shed, the mountain tracker, the temple's patient silence, the years spent doubting evidence long after everyone else had accepted it. It was during this same period, quietly, away from the League entirely, that Batman received unexpected news through an old contact within the GCPD's records division. Detective Michael Ferris, the original lead investigator on his parents' case, retired now for over a decade, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Bruce attended the small funeral privately, unrecognized, standing at the edge of a modest gathering of former colleagues and distant family. Afterward, quietly, discreetly, he arranged to have Ferris's private files, the personal notebooks the old detective had kept alongside his official reports, containing thoughts too speculative or unofficial to ever appear in a formal document, transferred, through several careful intermediaries, into his own possession. Late that night, alone in the cave, Bruce opened the old detective's final personal notebook and found, on its second-to-last page, a short, handwritten line that stopped him utterly still. Wayne case. Something never sat right. Should have pushed harder. Ran out of time. Nothing more. No name, no theory, no missing page recovered, no shell casing explained. Just a single, honest admission from the one man who had stood closest to the truth decades ago, and had felt, just as young Bruce had felt, kneeling in the rain as a boy, that the case had never truly been complete. Bruce closed the notebook slowly and sat for a long while in the quiet hum of the Bat computer's pale blue light. It was not an answer. It would never be an answer, not entirely. But it was, perhaps, the most important piece of evidence he had gathered in 30 years of searching. Confirmation, finally, from the one professional who had been there from the beginning, that his instinct as a frightened 8-year-old boy had never been foolish at all. Someone else had felt it too, and had simply run out of time to follow it. Batman intended, quietly, patiently, not to make the same mistake. Rain falls over Crime Alley the way it always has, and Batman stands here now, older than the boy who once knelt in this exact spot, holding a worn leather notebook containing every thread he had gathered across an entire lifetime of careful, disciplined searching. He lays them out, quietly, in his mind, the way his forensic teacher once taught him to lay evidence across a steel table, without emotion, without hierarchy, each piece given equal weight, regardless of how badly he wished one of them mattered more than the others. A witness statement that grew more detailed across 9 unexplained days. A shell casing whose markings never quite matched its own photograph. A missing page, absent without record, that an old detective's private notebook suggested might have concealed something worth pursuing. 18 inches of displaced stain upon an alley wall that no official diagram had ever accounted for. A precision of gunfire inconsistent with the panic a robbery was supposed to produce. A final, half-finished confession from the one man who had stood closest to the truth and simply run out of time. 6 threads. 30 years. And still, standing here in the rain, Batman understands something he could not have accepted as a younger man, desperate for resolution. None of these threads, alone or together, constitute proof of anything. They are inconsistencies, the ordinary, unavoidable texture of any investigation conducted by exhausted, overburdened people during a frightened, grieving moment in a city's history. A trained eye can find small cracks like these in almost any closed case, if it looks patiently enough. Perhaps that is all they ever were. Perhaps his parents' deaths truly were exactly what the original report described. A tragic, senseless act of violence made slightly untidy by human error, nothing more sinister hiding beneath its surface. Or perhaps not. Perhaps somewhere, buried in a missing page or an old detective's unfinished doubt, a larger truth waits patiently for evidence Batman has not yet found, technology not yet invented, a witness not yet located. He allows himself, standing in the rain, to sit honestly with both possibilities at once, something his very first lesson, all those years ago in his father's old study, had tried to teach him before he was ready to understand it. Facts and truth are not the same thing. He had learned this as a boy reading a case file by lamplight. He understands it now, decades later, standing in the exact place where the file itself began, in a way that no longer frightens him. The mystery of his parents' deaths may never fully resolve. Some cases, no matter how patiently pursued, no matter how many decades of skill are brought to bear against them, remain permanently, honestly, incomplete. He has solved impossible locked rooms. He has recovered children lost for over a decade. He has correctly read the shifting eyes of murderers who fooled trained juries. And still, this one small alley, the very first mystery of his life, continues to hold something back from him. He used to believe this fact would break him, if he ever allowed himself to accept it fully. Tonight, standing quietly in the rain, cape heavy with water, exactly as it was the night this story began, he finds instead something closer to peace. Because somewhere across the long architecture of his life, through forensic laboratories and mountain temples, through Arkham's broken mines and a satellite orbiting far above the clouds, Bruce Wayne came to understand something his 8-year-old self could never have known to look for. The mystery of his parents' murder was never truly the destination of his life's work. It was the door. The question that would not leave was never meant to be answered quickly, or completely, or even at all. It was meant to teach him how to search, patiently, honestly, without ever mistaking comfort for truth, or a closed case for a finished one. Every missing child he found afterward, every locked room he opened, every criminal mind he learned to understand before it ever committed its crime, every unanswered question the city of Gotham quietly handed him across 30 years of patient work, all of it grew from the same small, stubborn root that first took hold of him in this alley, in the rain, as a frightened boy who simply refused to accept an incomplete story. He closes the notebook gently, and for the first time in decades does not immediately reach to add another entry. Some mysteries, he understands now, are never meant to close. They are meant, instead, to keep a person searching, carefully, honestly, for the whole of a life. And perhaps, he thinks, standing quietly in the rain that has never once stopped visiting this alley, that was always the true inheritance his parents left behind. Not a mystery to solve, a reason to keep looking. Epilogue. Dawn over Gotham. The Bat computer hums quietly in the dark, its pale blue glow softening at last as another long patrol comes to its end. Screens dim one by one, evidence folders, examined and carefully cross-referenced through the small hours of the morning, return to their shelves in the precise order they belong. A small ritual of order in a life devoted to untangling chaos. That man moves through the cave the way he always does at this hour, unhurried, methodical, checking each piece of equipment with the same patient attention he once gave to fingerprint powder and shell casings in laboratories half a world away. The cowl comes off last. Beneath it, simply, is a tired man who has spent another night giving the city something it will never fully know to thank him for. Upstairs, Alfred has left coffee warming quietly in the kitchen, though it will likely grow cold again before Bruce reaches it, exactly as it has 1,000 mornings before this one. Some rituals persist not because they succeed, but because they are comforting in their familiarity. Much like an old case file, reread so many times, its pages have softened at the corners, waiting patiently in a desk drawer for a morning that may or may not ever fully resolve it. Outside, dawn arrives over Gotham the way it always does. Reluctantly, grey light easing over wet rooftops, softening the hard edges of a city that spent all night pretending it never sleeps. Streetlights flicker off one by one, no longer needed. Somewhere far below, a bakery begins its morning work. The first ordinary smell of bread rising into streets that, only hours ago, belonged to something far more careful, far more watchful. Bruce Wayne stands for a moment at the tall windows of the manor's east wing, watching the light spread slowly across the distant skyline. Crime Alley, somewhere among the countless rooftops he cannot quite see from here, though he never truly needs to see it. It is always present, quietly, the way a single unresolved question remains present in a mind trained never entirely to let it go. He thinks, in this quiet hour, of everything the years have taught him, that evidence and truth are rarely the same thing, and that the gap between them is where a patient mind does its finest work. That every witness, every criminal, every frightened stranger reveals more in silence than in speech, for those willing to listen carefully enough. That the world's cruelest puzzles are rarely solved by strength, but by attention. Sustained, humble, endlessly renewed attention, applied patiently across however many years the truth requires. He thinks, too, of a boy kneeling in the rain, certain that something did not fit, though he lacked entirely the language or the skill to say why. That boy could never have imagined the journey his question would demand of him: forensic laboratories and mountain monasteries, Arkham's broken mines and a satellite far above the clouds, an old detective's dying confession and a notebook now worn soft with 30 years of careful, honest doubt. He never became the strongest man in Gotham. He never intended to. He became, instead, the one person the city, and eventually the world, could trust to look carefully enough, patiently enough, honestly enough, to find what everyone else had missed. The mystery of his parents' deaths remains, even now, unfinished. Perhaps it always will. But somewhere in the accepting of that, in the quiet peace of understanding that some truths arrive slowly, if they arrive at all, Bruce Wayne finally became exactly what that unanswered question had always been patiently shaping him to be. Below the manor, the city continues waking. Somewhere in its winding streets, another small mystery is already beginning to form. A missing detail no one else will notice. An inconsistency someone else will overlook. A quiet thread waiting patiently for someone willing to follow it, wherever it leads. Bruce Wayne finishes his coffee, cold now, exactly as he always seems to prefer it, without quite admitting why, and turns from the window toward the long day ahead. Somewhere beneath the manor, the cave settles into its quiet morning stillness. Evidence rests undisturbed upon its shelves. The city breathes on, unaware, as it always is, of exactly how much of its safety depends on one man's refusal, decades ago, to accept an incomplete story. Dawn continues spreading gently across Gotham's rooftops. And somewhere, quietly, patiently, another mystery waits. Fade into silence.